The tragedy of racial segregation in modern American history is well known and documented. This policy advocated for the separation of people by race in their daily lives. Things such as attending school, riding a bus, or eating in a restaurant were different for blacks and whites in the southern part of the United States. Americans know by heart the impact that protests in Little Rock, Arkansas, Montgomery, Alabama, or Greensboro, North Carolina had in ending discrimination in the Jim Crow era. The struggle to end, separate but equal, was fought on other battlefields as well. Public libraries throughout the South also saw protests for the desegregation of these facilities to make them free to all. One of these demonstrations occurred in Greenville, South Carolina, in 1960, where Jesse Jackson led 7 other students in a sit-in at the main branch reserved for white patrons. These brave men and women became known as the Greenville 8. The library protest helped spark other demonstrations in Greenville at lunch counters, parks, and swimming pools. Fearing a federal lawsuit, county library officials closed both the main branch and the one reserved for blacks indefinitely. As pressure mounted and complaints increased, the libraries were eventually reopened to all citizens, integrating the facilities. The triumph over segregation by the Greenville 8 was one small step in a decades-long struggle to end discrimination and promote equality. Greenville, South Carolina, in the Jim Crow era, was typical of many southern cities in having 2 libraries. Blacks were forbidden from using the white library, which had more books, periodicals, and reference materials. High school and college students like Jesse Jackson would be at a disadvantage in writing research papers. There was an economic impact as well. Black citizens paid taxes to the city to support a library they could not use. Benjamin Downs, a member of the Greenville 8, describes his rationale for protesting this unjust rule.
The public library, simply from the fact that the Spartanburg and Columbia libraries had already been integrated, and they were supported by the tax funds, that was collected from Greenville County. And even though there was segregated facilities, the monies weren't segregated. As they didn't say, well, these came from the black folk and these came from the white folk.
While on semester break in early 1960, Greenville native and University of Illinois freshman Jesse Jackson needed sources for an assignment that only the Main Street branch had. He was told it would take 6 days to get the books, and when he inquired about getting the sources himself, he was told by 2 police officers to leave. Dr. Way Wigan, historian and author of a new book on the desegregation of public libraries, described Jackson's reaction.
Jackson stormed out the library's rear door, walked to the front of the building, and looked up. I just stared up at that Greenville Public Library, and tears came to my eyes. I said to myself, that thing says public, and my father's a veteran and pays taxes. Angry and humiliated, he decided to take action. When I get back home this summer, he said, I'm going to use that library.
Jackson was determined to use the public library when he returned to Greenville for summer break. On July 16th, Jackson and 7 other students arrived and were told by police to leave. The group dispersed, and Jackson reported to his mentor, the Reverend James S. Hall, Jr., that they avoided arrest. They were instructed to go back. A few hours later, the Greenville 8 entered the library and began to quietly read books and magazines. Refusing to leave when instructed, the police were called and all 8 were arrested for disorderly conduct. As Jackson later recalled, I was arrested along with 7 other students for advocating for the right to use a public library in my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina. I remember it like it was yesterday, for that day changed my life forever. From that experience, I lost my fear of being jailed for a righteous cause. I went on to meet Dr. King and dedicate my heart and soul to the fight for justice, equality, and equal access. In an oral history, Marguerite Crosby, one of the Greenville 8, describes what it was like to go to jail as a teenager.
After that, we got hate phone calls Our names were in the paper. Our telephone numbers were in the paper as if we were real bad criminals. No one heard us say anything. It was just like we had done something wrong. I guess I felt like it was hatred. I felt it then. When I was going to the library, I felt within my heart, I felt within my soul that it was hatred.
Legal implications of the protests were postponed when a judge decided to delay the trial of the offenders. Tensions in the community continued to rise, as fights erupted between blacks and whites at lunch counters and drive-ins. Fearing increased violence, newspaper editors cautioned blacks about their conduct and believed sit-ins harmed their cause. They also suggested to whites to have more patience. Eventually, a 9 p.m. curfew was imposed for all Greenville residents under the age of 21. The curfew was eventually lifted as racial tensions diminished when major retailers like Woolworths and Grant's announced that they would end racial segregation at lunch counters in southern cities, including Greenville. The reaction to the library protest varied. Whites refused to support integrated facilities. Some older blacks were also against the library protest and viewed the Greenville 8 as troublemakers. Jackson's own stepfather criticized him for how the protest and jailing reflected on their family. Nevertheless, the library sit-in prompted other demonstrations in Greenville at lunch counters, parks, and municipal pools throughout the summer of 1960. On July 28th, a federal lawsuit was filed on behalf of the protesters. In late August, county officials attempted to dismiss the case. When that strategy failed, the Greenville City Council voted to close both libraries indefinitely rather than be ordered to integrate the facilities. Pressure to reopen the library mounted as citizens of both races demanded a solution. Dee Dee Wright, one of the Greenville 8, wrote that the principle of maintaining a dual library system came at a steep price. She argued in an editorial that the integration of libraries is not only morally right, but it is also less expensive as well. On September 19th, all city libraries opened. While there was no mention of the word integration, the intent was clear. All citizens with the legitimate need to use the library were welcomed. The impact of the Greenville 8 protest continues today. At an American Library Association meeting in June 2018, a resolution was passed that acknowledged the injustice and cruelty of racially segregated libraries. Apologizing to African Americans for wrongs committed against them, the organization encouraged modern libraries to defend, in their policies and actions, the principle of providing the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. Speaking at the event, Joan Madison Daniels, one of the Greenville 8, describes how segregation affected her community.
One lady came and said, "We don't serve niggas." We said, "We didn't order any." It was just something, but we wanted to make a change. Even in the swimming pool, they had one big swimming pool in the park, and we would ride through the park, you couldn't swim. So one day, some students went and got in the pool. Do you know they filled that pool up with dirt and planted flowers so we wouldn't be able to swim?
The legacy of the Greenville 8 continues to grow. All were friends, and many had leadership roles in the community. Dee Dee Wright was the president of the Youth Council of the NAACP, and like the others, was prepared to go to jail to test unfair laws. The successful integration of the library in Greenville helped overcome the tragedy of segregation. Young people of that time, people like the Greenville 8, believed that direct action resulted in change. Their willingness to suffer harassment and jailing led to the triumphant desegregation of the library and was one small step toward racial justice and equality. As Jesse Jackson said at the 50th anniversary of the protest, "In this place of hope, 50 years ago, we found rejection and degradation. We persevered, and now America is better off for it."